Now let's get the animator set up. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our assets folder and make a new folder. I'm going to call this new folder the Myro prefab. And within this folder, I will create a new animator controller. And I'll call this the Myro animator controller. In order to see the contents of my animator controller, I have to go to my animator window, which is usually going to be right next to your scene. And it looks like this when it's empty. If you don't see the animator, you can go to the Window, Animation, Animator panel in the menu options. What we want to do is find the animations for our Terrorbringer. So I will go to the For Evil Dragons, Animations, Dragon Terrorbringer folder, and open it up. And we're going to be using 7 animations in this lesson. There will be Die, Fly Glide, Idle, O1, Landing, Run, and Walk. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's one more. Take off. So it's going to be these 7. Can I drag and drop? I can. Perfect. So we've got Die. I'll put that at the top. We've got Fly Glide. There's going to be a very specific way I'm going to set this animator up. So it really doesn't matter until you start making transitions. So just trust that I'm setting something up in a useful way. I'm going to make a small triangle with Fly Glide, Land, and Takeoff. And then I'm going to make a slightly bigger triangle with Idle, Walk, and Run. This is going to be the general setup. I'm going to start by setting a default animation state, which idle is the one that we want. So I'll select my idle node, right click on it, and select set as layer default state. I'm going to then make some transitions to handle some of my other animations. I'll explain the way that we get the best results from our animations in the transition settings. But first, you right click on the node you want to transition from and select Make Transition. Then you select the transition or the node that you want to transition to, in this case, Walk. So now I have a arrow that shows my transition. You have a bunch of settings for how you transition and then conditions, and you can hit plus, but we do not currently have parameters, meaning we want to make some parameters. So let's go ahead and do that. In order to make the parameters, you go to this column on the left side of your animator. You'll see that there's 2 tabs, Layers and Parameters. Parameters is what we'll start with, and we'll click this little plus button with the drop-down. You have the choice between 4 different variable types, a float, which is a decimal point number, integer, which is whole numbers, boolean, true or false, and triggers. The triggers are something where you flip the trigger once and it will be used once and then set back to untriggered. We're going to primarily make booleans and triggers for this step of the animation. I'm going to start by creating a boolean, and I will call this boolean walking. We have a bunch of other booleans, so let's go ahead and create them. A bunch of other booleans and triggers. So we'll make a boolean and call this charging. And we will create another boolean and call this gliding. We will create a trigger and call this jump. We'll create a boolean and call this grounded. We'll create a trigger and call this die. We'll create another trigger and call this revive. And we will create one last trigger and call this breath. These will be all of the different parameters that can potentially be called through an animator script that will then enable us to modify the state of the animator. So let's go back and click on our arrow transition between idle and walk. And let's talk about what we see in the inspector when we have it selected. We have a checkbox for has exit time, along with a drop-down that shows a bunch of settings. We don't have to worry about this, but if you get into animation, this will reflect different settings as you toy with these other things. But if you really wanted to get granular, you could control it with the settings. We won't need to do that. So I'm going to close up my settings. And then you have this transition window. This shows the state you're transitioning from, the state you're transitioning to, at what point in the original animation you start the transition, and at what point in the new animation you end the transition. You have these two little arrows that show the duration that the animation happens over. And on 3D models, this actually creates an interpolation between the animations through the bones so that there's a smoother transition. What I'm going to do is set this to a very small window and move the walk over this way. This will result in a relatively instantaneous, but not too abrupt transition. The character will snap pretty quickly, but it won't be incredibly intense. It tends to be more jarring when you have weird and uncanny animations because this window was too wide. If you have an animator who has very specifically set up the animations, that is a good idea. The last thing I'll have us do is set a condition. And in this case, for idle, we want to have a condition. When does it go from idle to walking? And we can hit our drop down and select walking. Because this is a Boolean, we have a true or false option. So I'm going to say when walking is true, we will transition from idle to walk. Lastly, we have our has exit time, meaning the animation has to completely transition, or it will only transition when the animation gets to the start of this blue arrow. But if you uncheck has exit time, it will instantly transition the moment walking no longer equals false. So we're going to uncheck that, and that's going to give us an optimal output from the animation transition. And most of our animations will be like this with a couple exceptions. Now I'll make a transition back. I'll right click on walk, make the transition, and click. I'll select my transition, uncheck has exit time. I will minimize the transition window and minimize the overlap. And because we're going from walk to idle, what we will do is set walking is false. And there we go. That is our transition.